On 5th to 7th October 1967, in the town of Asaba in what is now Delta State, Nigeria, hundreds of peaceful civilians were rounded up, separated, and gunned down by federal troops. This massacre, largely suppressed in history books, remains a haunting example of the brutal price civilians pay in war. In this video, we uncover what led to the massacre, hear survivor voices, explore the cover-up, and ask, how can we remember, heal, and prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again? If you found this video insightful, please like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into hidden chapters of history. Imagine standing in your hometown, waving a white cloth in surrender, believing that peace had finally arrived, only to be met with a hail of bullets. This was the chilling reality in Asaba, Nigeria, in October 1967. What happened here isn't just a forgotten chapter in a dusty textbook. It's a haunting example of what happens when silence replaces justice, when atrocities go unpunished, and when history is left to decay in the shadows. The Asaba massacre didn't begin in isolation. It was the violent consequence of mounting ethnic tensions, political miscalculations, and the brutal logic of a civil war that turned neighbor against neighbor. Nigeria, freshly independent from British colonial rule in 1960, was a country trying to define itself across deeply fractured lines: North versus South, Igbo versus Hausa Fulani, federalism versus secession. The collapse of trust between the regions led to a coup, a counter-coup, and finally, the secession of the southeastern region as the Republic of Biafra. By July 1967, the country was engulfed in full-scale war. As Biafran troops briefly advanced into the Midwestern region, federal forces launched a fierce counteroffensive. Town after town fell, but when they reached Asaba, a largely Igbo-populated town along the Niger River, there was no fierce resistance. The Biafran soldiers had already retreated. What remained were civilians, men, women, children, who came out with white flags, traditional dancers, and songs of peace. They welcomed the troops. They pleaded for mercy. Instead, they were rounded up. The women and children were separated. The men, boys as young as 12, elders as old as 70, were gathered on the town square. And then came the bullets. Reports say anywhere from 500 to over 1,000 people were killed in cold blood. Bodies fell over one another. Some were thrown into mass graves. Others left to rot under the scorching sun. It wasn't a battle. It wasn't a mistake. It was an orchestrated purge. This video isn't about sensationalism. It's about historical responsibility. Because what happened in Asaba wasn't just an isolated war crime. It's a mirror reflecting the dangers of unchecked power, ethnic scapegoating, and the erasure of uncomfortable truths. To this day, there has been no official apology from the Nigerian government, no tribunal, no public memorial until recent efforts by the community itself. Just silence. But silence has a cost. Survivors are still living with the trauma. Entire family lines were wiped out. Generations grew up without knowing what really happened. And the danger of forgetting is that it makes repetition possible. How do we, as a society, learn from history if the truth is hidden, distorted, or denied? In this documentary, we're going to peel back the layers. We'll explore the political roots of the conflict. We'll revisit the events leading up to those horrific days in October 1967. You'll hear the voices of survivors, those who lived through the nightmare and those who carry the scars. We'll look at the aftermath, the cover-up, the pain, and the quiet resistance of memory. And finally, we'll ask, what does justice look like today? This isn't just Nigerian history, it's human history. The Asaba massacre is part of a global pattern where the fog of war obscures accountability, and civilians are turned into statistics. Whether it's My Lai in Vietnam, Nanking in China, or Srebrenica in Bosnia, there's a disturbing familiarity to these stories. But each one is unique, each voice worth hearing. So if you're watching this and wondering why you've never heard of this before, you're not alone. And that's exactly why this story needs to be told. Because history doesn't just live in books, it lives in the people who survive, in the families who mourn, and in the nations who decide whether to remember or forget. Stay with us as we uncover the events, the testimonies, and the enduring impact of the Asaba massacre, a tragedy the world must not forget. To understand the Asaba massacre, we must first go back to the very birth of Nigeria as a nation. Independence from Britain in 1960 promised hope, but what came next was confusion, manipulation, and division. Nigeria was a country stitched together by colonial convenience, not cultural cohesion. Over 250 ethnic groups, multiple religions, and sharp regional differences were forced into a single political experiment, one that was set to explode. The country's first years were turbulent. Power struggles between the North, South, and the East bred resentment and suspicion. In January 1966, a military coup led by predominantly Igbo officers overthrew the civilian government. Northern leaders were among those assassinated. The coup failed, but it ignited a chain of retaliation. A counter-coup in July that same year brought Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon to power. In the north, anti-Igbo pogroms began. Tens of thousands of Igbo civilians were slaughtered in broad daylight, hacked to death in markets, hunted in their homes, their only crime being their ethnicity. As the violence intensified, the eastern region, led by Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, declared independence on May 30, 1967, forming the Republic of Biafra. To many Easterners, especially the Igbo, it was a matter of survival. But to the federal government, it was treason. What followed was one of Africa's deadliest civil wars. Federal forces moved quickly to isolate the new state. They blockaded the region, cutting off food, medicine, and weapons. They called it strategy. The world would later call it genocide. Over 2 million civilians, mostly children, would die of starvation. But long before the images of emaciated babies reached global headlines, brutal ground battles were already devastating local towns and villages. One of the earliest and most symbolic moves of the Biafran army was to cross the Niger and take the Midwestern region, aiming to march toward Lagos and bring the war to Nigeria's heart. It was a bold move, one that briefly shocked the federal government, but it was short-lived. The Biafran offensive stalled, and federal troops, better armed and numerically superior, launched a fierce counterattack. As the federal forces reclaimed towns, they brought not just the flag of Nigeria, but the rage of retribution. They accused civilians of collaboration with Biafran forces, without evidence, without trial. Towns were punished. And then came Asaba, a town that, while Igbo by ethnicity, had not resisted the federal troops. Its people wanted peace. They came out waving white flags, but by then, the die had already been cast. Ethnic suspicion had poisoned the chain of command. To the advancing soldiers, every Igbo face looked like the enemy. They weren't looking for rebels. They were looking for revenge. And so the massacre that would unfold in Asaba was not just a military operation. It was the horrifying climax of a country unraveling from the inside. Asaba became a target not for what it did, but for what it was. An Igbo town on the wrong side of the war, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. October 5th, 1967. Asaba was tense but hopeful. News had spread that federal troops had crossed the Niger and were moving in. The Biafran army, realizing they couldn't hold the line, had already retreated. The people of Asaba, teachers, traders, farmers, decided to act in the only way they could, by welcoming the troops peacefully. Women and children wore white. Men held up palm fronds, waving symbols of surrender. They chanted, "One Nigeria." They danced in the streets. But federal troops, many of them from the 2nd Division under the command of Colonel Murtala Muhammad, did not see surrender. They saw deception, or at least that's how they justified what came next. Within hours, looting began. Homes were ransacked. Men were dragged out and accused of being Biafran sympathizers. Beatings followed. Then the shootings began, not in the chaos of battle, but in organized waves. The worst came on October 7th. Federal soldiers ordered all males to report to Ogbeosawa Square. They claimed it was for a head count, for documentation. Entire families, grandfathers, fathers, sons, marched together, believing this was the final step toward restoring peace. What they didn't know was that the ground they stood on would soon be soaked in blood. Once gathered, the women and children were separated and driven away. The men were made to lie on the ground or stand in rows. Then, without warning, the soldiers opened fire. Machine guns ripped through the crowd. Screams filled the air. Bodies fell. And still, the shooting continued. Survivors later described lying motionless beneath piles of corpses, pretending to be dead, praying the soldiers wouldn't notice they were still breathing. Estimates vary. Some say 500 were killed. Others believe the number surpassed 1,000. It's hard to be certain. There were no official records, no forensic analysis, no justice. Only stories passed down. Only graves, some marked, most not. Elsewhere in town, smaller executions were carried out. Men hiding in homes were dragged out and shot. Those trying to flee were chased down. The River Niger, once a lifeline, became a channel for escape, and a grave for those caught. Young boys were not spared. Age offered no protection, nor did innocence. In the days that followed, the bodies were left where they fell. The stench of death filled the air. Women were forced to dig mass graves. Some buried their husbands and sons with bare hands, unable to find shovels or even cloth to wrap them. The town was shattered. Life, as it had been, ended that week. This was not war. This was vengeance. This was a message. And yet, it was a message no one wanted to admit had been sent. You can study the events. You can analyze the timelines. But nothing captures the horror of the Asaba massacre like the voices of those who lived through it. "I saw my father fall," says Chukwuemeka Nwaneri, who was just 14 years old in 1967. "One minute he was holding my hand. The next, he was on the ground. Blood came out of his mouth. I didn't even have time to cry. I just dropped and pretended to be dead." Chukwuemeka lay still under his father's corpse for hours before crawling out in the dark. He never saw his older brother again. Neka Mordi, who was 18 at the time, recalls being separated from her family. "They told us to go home, the women. We went. But we didn't know we were leaving our brothers to die. My mother kept saying, 'It's a registration. They'll be back for lunch.' We cooked yam. No one came back." Survivor testimonies often return to the same horrifying details: the sound of bullets, the smell of blood, the unbearable silence afterward. One woman, now in her 70s, recounted how she found her husband's body 2 days later, with his Bible still in his shirt pocket. Another survivor described soldiers forcing elderly men to dance before shooting them. These aren't just memories. They're scars that never fully healed. What's chilling is how calculated it all seemed. Survivors described officers giving orders. This wasn't a rogue unit acting out in a moment of chaos. This was planned, organized, executed with intention, and it was followed by silence. No explanation, no acknowledgement, only fear. For decades, many survivors couldn't talk about what they saw. The trauma was too deep, the risks too great. Nigeria never held a public inquiry. No war crimes tribunal ever convened. For a long time, even families didn't speak of it. The grief was too raw. The shame of surviving when so many others did not, too heavy. But silence eventually gave way to remembrance. In the early 2000s, a new generation began asking questions. Historians, activists, and children of the fallen started collecting testimonies. From dusty notebooks and whispered stories came the truth, a truth the world could no longer ignore. One survivor put it best: they tried to erase us. But we lived. And because we lived, we will speak. In the wake of the massacre, Asaba was not just a town in mourning. It was a town erased. The soldiers moved on, leaving behind destruction, silence, and the unbearable stench of death. The town square was stained with blood. Homes were shattered. Entire family lines had been wiped out. And for those who survived, what came next was not healing, it was erasure. Women and children wandered the streets in disbelief. Mothers searched for sons. Wives waited for husbands who would never return. Survivors were left to bury the dead, quickly, quietly, with whatever they could find. There were no coffins, no prayers, no time to mourn. In some cases, dogs were already scavenging the bodies before burial. It was a scene of devastation, and it was happening in total silence from the rest of the world. No one came to help. No journalists, no Red Cross, no federal investigations. In fact, the Nigerian government made no official mention of what had taken place in Asaba. The military leadership issued no statement. No inquiries were made. No one was charged. The massacre was absorbed into the fog of war, a war that would continue for another 2.5 years, consuming even more lives. Locally, fear silenced survivors. Speaking out could mean being labeled a rebel. Families were afraid to ask questions. Teachers avoided the topic in schools. It was safer to forget, at least on the surface. But the trauma lived on, in dreams, in whispered conversations, in empty seats at family gatherings. Internationally, the massacre barely registered. The global media focused on the starvation crisis in Biafra, those heart-wrenching images of children with swollen bellies. Asaba was buried beneath more photogenic suffering. Western governments, eager to maintain relations with oil-rich Nigeria, avoided condemning the federal army's actions. Realpolitik triumphed over justice. Even after the war ended in 1970, nothing changed. Survivors returned to their rebuilt homes, but not to justice. Many federal soldiers involved in the massacre went on to have successful military and political careers. The victims' families received no reparations, no recognition. It was as if the dead had never existed. But memory has a way of resisting silence. In the 1990s and early 2000s, local activists began pushing for remembrance. Oral histories were collected. Memorials were held in secret. Eventually, efforts led to the creation of the Asaba Memorial Project, dedicated to documenting what happened and preserving the testimonies of survivors. For the first time, the massacre was given a name. And names, as we know, are the beginning of justice. Still, the Nigerian state has yet to formally acknowledge the massacre. No Truth and Reconciliation Commission has ever addressed it. It remains one of the darkest, most unspoken events in the country's modern history. And yet, the people of Asaba remember. They always have. In Asaba today, the echoes of October 1967 still linger, in names not spoken, in streets once soaked in blood, and in the eyes of those who remember. But memory, long buried under fear and silence, is no longer hidden. It breathes in songs sung by elders. It whispers in family stories told at dusk. It stands now in public spaces as resistance against forgetting. For decades there was no memorial, only quiet pain. But as survivors aged and children demanded answers, memory took form. The Asaba Memorial Project, launched by community members and scholars, became a powerful force in collecting oral testimonies, archiving photographs, and naming the unnamed. Memory was no longer a burden, it was a duty. Today, an annual day of remembrance is held in Asaba. Families gather to light candles, sing songs of sorrow, and read the names of the fallen. It's not just a ritual, it's a reclaiming, a declaration that these lives mattered, that they won't be statistics lost in a forgotten war, that they were fathers, brothers, uncles, human beings whose only crime was being born at the wrong place and time. Monuments now dot the town, small but defiant. A concrete square bearing the names of the dead. A mural with images drawn from memory. These aren't just artistic expressions, they are acts of historical protest. In a country that still hasn't formally acknowledged the massacre, every memorial is a challenge to official silence. But remembrance hasn't been easy. Some government officials still deny that a massacre occurred. Others claim it was collateral damage of war. Survivors have had to fight not just for recognition, but against gaslighting. It's a second trauma, the denial of their pain. And yet, the story of Asaba is also a story of resilience. Children of survivors have become historians, lawyers, journalists. They carry the burden of memory with purpose. They are ensuring that what happened is taught, not as myth, but as fact. In universities, books, documentaries, and now videos like this one. More broadly, the Asaba massacre has become a symbol of all those massacres the world tries to forget. It reminds us that memory is not passive, it's political. To remember is to resist the erasure of truth. To speak is to demand justice, even if delayed. In remembering Asaba, Nigeria confronts not just a chapter of war, but the question of who gets to write history and who gets to be heard. You might ask, why does a massacre from 1967 matter today? Why dig up the bones of the past when Nigeria is already burdened with present-day problems? But here's the truth. What we refuse to confront, we're doomed to repeat. Asaba isn't just a story about history. It's a warning, a lesson, a mirror. The ethnic divisions that fueled the Nigerian Civil War didn't die with the ceasefire in 1970. They evolved, they shifted, they remained. The same seeds of distrust between groups, between government and people, still grow in today's politics, religion, and identity. The massacre may have ended decades ago, but the silence it was buried under still speaks loudly in how Nigeria handles conflict and justice. When communities are targeted because of ethnicity, when voices are silenced in the name of national unity, when victims are told to move on without acknowledgement, those are not relics of the past. They are symptoms of a still bleeding wound. The massacre at Asaba is a case study in what happens when power goes unchecked, when accountability is sacrificed for political convenience. It matters today because the survivors are still with us. And so are the children of the perpetrators. Healing can't happen without truth. Reconciliation cannot exist without recognition. When a nation fails to confront its violent history, it builds its future on denial, and that's a dangerous foundation. Globally, Asaba fits into a larger pattern of how the world treats civilian massacres. From Rwanda to Bosnia, from Darfur to Gaza, the question remains. When civilians are murdered in war, who pays the price? Too often the answer is no one. The world moves on. Headlines fade, and justice is replaced with diplomatic silence. But Asaba also reminds us that communities can fight back, not with weapons, but with memory, with truth, with testimony. That people can reclaim their stories, even when the state refuses to tell them. That healing, though slow and painful, is possible when the first step, naming the crime, is taken. So yes, it matters, because this isn't just about Nigeria. It's about every country that has chosen amnesia over accountability. It's about every victim who was told their pain wasn't real. It's about whether we, as a global society, will continue to accept mass violence as an unavoidable cost of war, or finally, draw a line. The Asaba massacre demands an answer. The story of the Asaba massacre is not just a tale of tragedy. It is a call to remember, a demand to confront, and a challenge to act. Hundreds of innocent lives were lost in the span of a few days, not because they picked up arms, but because they were born into the wrong ethnic group in a time of war. Their only crime was believing that peace could protect them, but memory is a form of justice. By telling their story, we give those victims what the bullets tried to steal: humanity, dignity, and legacy. We defy the silence that has shrouded this massacre for over 5 decades, and we say to the world, these lives mattered, their pain mattered, and so does the truth. Asaba is more than history. It's a mirror for our present. In every society, we are faced with choices: to remember or to forget, to confront or to conceal, to stand for justice or to bow to convenience. And history has shown us what happens when we choose silence. The cost is always human. So what can you do? Start by sharing this video. Start a conversation. Ask why this event isn't taught in Nigerian schools or discussed in its parliament. Support organizations like the Asaba Memorial Project. Demand a national reckoning, because healing is not passive. It's something we must build together. And if you're watching this from outside Nigeria, ask yourself, what stories are being hidden in your country? What tragedies have been buried under flags and silence? Asaba is not just a Nigerian wound. It is a human one. Thank you for staying.